As I'm sure most of you know, Richard Wendorf is the Stanford Calderwood director and librarian of the Boston Athenæum. He's also an art historian and a writer with a special interest in the 18th century and in the history of printing, appropriately so. In this year alone, 2 of his books have been published. The Scholar Librarian, which was published here at the Athenæum in the spring of this year, and After Sir Joshua, Essays on British Art and Cultural History, which has just come out from the Yale University Press, sponsored by the Paul Mellon Center for Studies in British Art at Yale. Indeed, it's this most recent book that is the impetus for Richard's talk tonight, which is entitled Burying Sir Joshua. This is the 6th in a series of lectures given by Richard, each of which has been based on what are now chapters in his latest publication. These lectures have focused on Sir Joshua Reynolds, Henry Raeburn, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, George Stubbs, and Giovanni Battista Piranesi. And tonight, bringing the topic full circle and back to Sir Joshua, possibly to praise him, but more pointedly to bury him, ladies and gentlemen, Richard Wendorf.
Thank you very much, David, and good evening. This is actually the 9th annual scholarly presentation that I've given here at the Athenæum, and the 3rd devoted to Sir Joshua Reynolds. You therefore have every reason to believe that it's high time I buried him, which is precisely what I intend to do this evening. Well, what happens when a painter dies? In the short run, of course, he or she is buried. And the burial of an important artist, particularly at the close of the 18th century, could be a major civic event. When Angelica Kauffmann died in 1807 in Rome, she was solemnly escorted to her grave by female attendants entirely dressed in white. When Reynolds died in London in 1792, we can be confident that the king did not drop a tear into the Queen's ear, as William Blake maliciously suggested. But George III did, ironically, enable the painter's friends and professional associates to bury him in style. In such style, and with such an outpouring of interest and even emotion by the city as a whole, that Reynolds' funeral was a much more powerful social and political event than the final rites of the Hanoverian kings themselves. It was, moreover, a consciously visual event, an elaborate spectacle, performed according to ancient hierarchical customs that now accommodated, although not without tension, one of the most prominent commoners of the 18th century. Reynolds' funeral therefore serves as a significant case study in late 18th century social and cultural history, enabling us to examine the sometimes competing forces at work as England's most successful artist was finally, slowly laid to rest. A variety of early published sources, combined with previously unpublished manuscript material in the Hyde Collection, which is now, I'm happy to say, at the Houghton Library, allow us to follow the preparations for Reynolds' funeral on a day-to-day basis. These were not simple preparations, and they were made all the more difficult by an unexpected obstacle that threatened to prevent Reynolds' executors, friends, and professional colleagues from honoring him in a suitably decorous way. This problem was finally resolved, as we shall see. Potential social discord led, in fact, to renewed social integration as the metropolis commemorated Reynolds' memory and honored, through his person, the elevation of the fine arts in England. But these are generalities, and it's best to begin with particulars. Chronically hard of hearing, blind in his left eye, and fearful of losing sight in the other, Reynolds put down his painting brush and maul stick for the last time in 1789, 3 years before his death. And Monica, I wonder if we can turn the lights down, please. I thought what I would do, just taking a moment here, is to lead you through Reynolds's life by showing you a series of self-portraits and a few portraits by other artists as well. So here's a very, very early portrait. I'm afraid it's in a black and white slide in which he looks remarkably like his two sisters. And here's probably the most famous self-portrait, painted as he returned from his sojourn to Italy. It was one of those turning points in his career as a painter, very dramatic, looking at himself in a mirror probably, because he was the only subject he could afford to paint. We need a little focus on that one. Another fairly early portrait, as you can see from the face, but now classicized and dressed up at the same time. And here's an even stronger version, very much looking like an academician at this point. Here he is in a very famous portrait in which he actually draws attention to his hardness of hearing, but also, I think, to the fact that he was a wonderful conversationalist. And here's a great portrait by Angelica Kauffman, who was very, very close to him, also drawing attention a little bit to his loss of hearing, but in a very subtle way. And a very serious portrait by the very young Gilbert Stuart. This is very much the president of the Royal Academy sitting there, looking a little like George Washington, in fact, as I've argued before in this room. And here he is in the great self-portrait at the Royal Academy. And here he is in the last self-portrait, in the last few years of his life. By the close of 1791, he began to suffer from other ailments, eventually confining himself to his house in Leicester Square for the last 3 months of his life. Many of his friends thought that his illness was imaginary, that he could recover if he would but exert himself, as his friend Edmund Malone put it. Early in February 1792, however, it was discovered that Reynolds was suffering from a disease of the liver. He died 2 weeks later, between 8 and 9 in the evening of Thursday, February 23rd. He was 68 years old. Never a religious person, far from it, to the indignation of his sisters and the disappointment of Samuel Johnson, Reynolds was nonetheless reconciled to his own demise, and he had carefully prepared for it. He had named his executors, prepared his will, and made some suggestions, somewhat contradictory, as we shall see, about the character of his funeral. Reynolds was familiar, moreover, with funerary customs and with the responsibilities of executorship. In 1774, he served as the executor of Oliver Goldsmith's estate, which, like many aspects of the writer's life, was generally thought to be confused. And there's Reynolds' wonderful portrait of him. James Northcote's account of the issues Reynolds encountered is worth quoting in full. At first, Reynolds intended to have made a grand funeral for Goldsmith, assisted by several subscriptions to that intent, and to have buried him in the Abbey. His pallbearers to have been Lord Shelburne, Lord Louth, Sir Joshua himself, Edmund Burke, David Garrick, etc. But on second thoughts, he resolved to have him buried in the plainest and most private manner possible, observing that the most pompous funerals are soon past and forgotten, and that it would be much more prudent to apply what money could be procured to the purpose of a more substantial and more lasting memorial of his departed friend by a monument. And Goldsmith was accordingly privately interred in the Temple burying ground. Sir Joshua went himself to Westminster Abbey and fixed upon the place where Goldsmith's monument now stands, over a door in the Poet's Corner. He thought himself lucky in being able to find so conspicuous a situation for it, as there scarcely remained another one so good. Well, Nollekens sculpted the monument, and Samuel Johnson composed the epitaph. In 1784, moreover, Reynolds was served as Johnson's executor and mourner. David Garrick's funeral in 1779, and here you see him in one of Reynolds' greatest paintings, being torn between comedy on the left and tragedy on the right. Garrick's funeral in 1779 was of a very different kind from both Goldsmith's and Johnson's. Sir Charles Leslie, Reynolds' 19th century biographer, could only describe it as pompous, and I quote, "So splendid a funeral, followed by mourners of such various distinction, had seldom been vouchsafed to poet or painter, soldier or statesman. Next in honor, perhaps, came Sir Joshua's own burial ceremony." The procession moved to Westminster Abbey from the terrace of the Adelphi, where Garrick and his wife had their London home. His pall was supported by a mixture of aristocrats and distinguished commoners. The first 19 coaches conveyed clergymen, doctors, the managers of Drury Lane and Covent Garden, and representatives from both theatres. Reynolds and other members of the club followed in the next 4 carriages. 7 additional vehicles included an assortment of musical and theatrical friends. The pomp of it all, Horace Walpole remarked, was perfectly ridiculous. And there's Horace Walpole. It's worth pausing a moment over Garrick's funeral because it marked the grandest event of its kind since the burials of the actor Thomas Betterton in 1710, the Duke of Marlborough in 1722, or Sir Isaac Newton in 1727. Although coronations and royal weddings continued to play an important role in the social and political life of the nation, funerary customs for English monarchs had become less public, beginning with the burial of Charles II in 1685. As Voltaire observed in his English Letters, and I quote him here, "What raises the admiration of the spectator is not the mausoleums of the English kings, but the monuments which the gratitude of the nation has erected to perpetuate the memory of those illustrious men who contributed to its glory." In denouncing the pomp of Garrick's funeral, Walpole was resisting, among other things, a powerful movement towards the recognition of artistic attainment. I quote him again, "It is confounding the immense space between pleasing talents and national service. What distinctions remain for a patriot hero when the most solemn have been showered on a player?" Even more than his predecessors' funerals, Garrick's therefore signaled a coalescence of national pride and mourning in the figure of a departed cultural statesman. When George II died in 1760, we should remember, the newspapers candidly reported that he had expired in the lavatory. The Gentleman's Magazine printed a colored diagram of his dissected heart. Although George II had ruled Great Britain for more than 30 years, one politician noted that his funeral was not well attended by the peers, nor even the king's old servants. Well, painters had fared little better. Hogarth died in his house in Leicester Fields, across the plaza from Reynolds, in October 1764. His body was conveyed to Chiswick, a cast was taken of his right hand, and he was buried in St. Nicholas's churchyard a week later. A monument was not erected until his sister Anne died in 1771. Garrick wrote the epitaph. Gainsborough, who died in 1788, was attended largely by his professional colleagues. Reynolds served as one of the pallbearers. The others were also drawn from the Royal Academy: Chambers, West, Myers, Coates, Sandby, and Bartolozzi. And the painter's name alone was carved on his tombstone in the churchyard at Kew. Well, it was presumably with a sense of modesty, or at least decorum, or even long-ingrained domestic parsimony, that Reynolds left directions that his funeral should be carried out as inexpensively as possible. In a letter to his son following the funeral, however, Edmund Burke was adept at weaving together the complicated and contradictory threads of Reynolds' stated intentions. "Everything," he wrote, "I think was just as if our deceased friend would living have wished it to be, for he was, as you know, not altogether indifferent to this kind of observance. He gave indeed a direction that no expense should be employed, but his desire to be buried at St. Paul's justified what we have done, and all circumstances demanded it. Well, given Reynolds's conflicting instructions, for a burial at St. Paul's could not be carried out at no expense, his executors must have huddled together as quickly as possible following his death. Edmund Burke served as the public voice of the deceased painter's family and as the guardian, and here's Burke on the right with Lord Rockingham in an unfinished portrait, and as the guardian of Mary Palmer, Sir Joshua's niece and heiress. The editor, Edmund Malone, acted as Reynolds's literary executor, and Philip Metcalfe, a brewer who served as MP for Plimpton Earl, and this is actually a portrait by Battoni, took principal responsibility for settling the painter's estate. We don't know who, besides Mary Palmer, his niece, attended Reynolds on the evening of his death, although we can assume that many of his friends, including his executors, were frequent visitors to his house. On Friday morning, Burke composed his formal tribute to his friend, often altering and correcting it as he proceeded. His character of Sir Joshua was printed in the Morning Chronicle the next day, and it would be quoted in part or in whole in virtually every remembrance of Reynolds to be published in the next 30 years. Burke, Metcalfe, and Mary Palmer met, as planned, on Friday afternoon for the reading of the will, which held only 2 surprises. Reynolds had forgotten to name his nephews in the Palmer family as beneficiaries of his estate, and he had listed his servant, Ralph Kirkley, as one of the witnesses of the will, even though Kirkley was also one of its legatees, an oversight that Burke corrected. At some point during the day, the distinguished physician Dr. John Hunter, Reynolds' neighbor in Leicester Square, assisted in the postmortem, which revealed that the painter's liver had become extremely enlarged. Mary Palmer believed, however, that Reynolds' personal physician, Sir George Baker, had taken good care of her uncle, and she sent him a warm letter of gratitude as well as one of Reynolds' self-portraits. Beginning on Saturday, February 25th, Metcalfe compiled a daily list of the arrangements that needed to be made so that the funeral could take place exactly a week later. That first Saturday was a very busy one. Malone was to see about an interment in St. Paul's, a site attractive to Reynolds' friends, not only because of his own wish to be buried there, but also because of Reynolds' largely unsuccessful campaign to fill the cathedral with works of British art. These arrangements went smoothly, and Reynolds would be lowered a week later into the crypt, not far from the final resting places of Christopher Wren and Anthony van Dyck. The executors also engaged the services of an undertaker, someone who would undertake many of the tasks associated with a funeral. And Adam Wright was therefore asked to wait on Sir William Chambers at Somerset House so that instructions could be given concerning the Academy coaches, cloaks, etc. And here is the first of 2 portraits of Sir William Chambers. Copies of the will were to be sent to the next of kin, and memorial rings were to be distributed. The first signals from the Royal Academy suggested that Reynolds' colleagues would be as accommodating as possible to the executors and to the painter's family. Chambers wrote to Burke on that Saturday, informing him that several of the academicians of the Royal Academy, quote, having signified to me their wish of paying the last honors to their late worthy president by attending at his funeral in a body, I have summoned a council to meet tomorrow to respond to the executor's wishes. He assured them that any proposal will be thankfully received and punctually complied with. Thankfully received, yes, but not punctually complied with. For Chambers, who had long served as Reynolds' arch rival for power at Somerset House, was about to surprise everyone, including his fellow academicians, with a dramatic volte-face. Burke and his fellow executors had asked that the painter's body be allowed to lie in state at the Academy on the following Friday evening and then conveyed in a procession to St. Paul's at noon the following day. Their proposal obviously made good sense, It would shorten the length of the procession, allow friends to pay their last respects in a space large enough to accommodate them, and unite Reynolds's body, for the last time, with the social and professional body that he had led for over 20 years. The arrangements were meant to ensure that Reynolds would enjoy the essential elements of the decent funeral, as it was defined by the middle of the 18th century. A well-attended procession, a distribution of tokens of remembrance to friends and relatives, and an appropriately furnished room for lying in, usually draped in black cloth, and then lighted with sconces to show off heraldic devices on the walls. Next to this proposal, on Sunday, February 26th, Metcalfe wrote, "Refused," in dark ink. The Council's decision was communicated to Metcalfe in a letter written by the Academy's secretary, John Richards. The Council, he wrote, sees many difficulties in inviting persons of high distinction to Somerset House unless they confine themselves to their own body. Considering, quote, the tenure by which they hold these apartments, they have to regret that they are not authorized to comply with the wishes of the executors. Chambers wrote his own note to Metcalfe the following day, announcing that the Council had agreed that, quote, it was not in their power to pursue the extensive plan proposed by the executors. Well, Metcalfe was furious. When he received this news on Sunday, he immediately complained to Burke that Sir William Chambers' cold civility terminates in the attendance of the Academy alone. On the following day, Monday, February 27th, he drafted a reply to John Richards in which he angrily argued that Reynolds's fame, and I quote here, does not depend upon his funeral. What we shall do with regard to attendance is to do honor to ourselves. The academicians, he suggested, are but judges of what suits them. He, Burke, and Malone, on the other hand, are executors of Sir Joshua's will and have only the ordinary duties of executors upon us. Later that day, in a manuscript note, he unhappily observed that he would not have suggested such a proposal in the first place had Chambers not raised the subject in his initial letter to Burke. Well, what precisely had gone wrong? In a biography of Reynolds published later in the year, Samuel Felton noted that the executor's request was instantly and almost unanimously agreed to by all present, except, he wrote, to the utter astonishment of everyone, by Sir William Chambers, who observed that they could not, with propriety, appropriate the rooms except to exhibit paintings and studies executed by the academicians. And here is Rigaud's great triple portrait. We have Chambers on the left, Reynolds on the right, and the poor sculptor Wilton caught between the two of them. Chambers served not only as the Academy's treasurer, but also as the surveyor of the building he had designed. And it was in this role that he reminded his colleagues that, I quote him, "The Academy cannot let or lend any part thereof for any other purpose than that it is appropriated for." Richards therefore entered in the Council minutes that, and I quote, "However desirous we were to show such a mark of respect to our late President, we were not in the possession of the power to do so." Chambers had, in effect, executed a devious maneuver by which Reynolds's friends and colleagues would be offended and frustrated, while he, the consummate behind-the-scenes manipulator, could not, at least technically, be blamed for the emotional impasse to which he had so audaciously brought them. Now that Reynolds was dead, it was precisely this mark of respect that Chambers wished to sabotage, or at least complicate. 2 years earlier, in the internecine conflict over the possible appointment of Joseph Bonomi as professor of perspective at the Academy, Chambers and a cohort of other democratically minded colleagues had effectively blocked Reynolds in his attempt to impose what they considered to be his autocratic, dictatorial rule at the Academy. Reynolds and Chambers had also fought over the possible adoption of uniforms by the academicians, over decisions about picture hanging at the annual exhibitions, and most recently, over the President's request in the summer of 1791 that the Academy contribute 100 guineas towards the cost of a statue of Samuel Johnson. Here's a version of the portrait by Reynolds. It's at the Houghton Library. For Johnson had served as the Academy's professor of ancient literature. This made sense to Reynolds, to his friends in the club, and to many academicians, but not to Chambers, who argued that, quote, one might with equal propriety have proposed the erection of a triumphal arch to Lord Heathfield, or a mausoleum to the inventor of fire engines, or a statue to anyone else whose excellence lay totally wide of ours at the Academy. Well, it was finally left to Benjamin West, and here's a wonderful self-portrait. It was finally left to Benjamin West to travel to Windsor to intercede directly with the King. West returned the following day to inform the Academy's General Assembly, quote, that he had communicated to His Majesty the proposals received from the executors of Sir Joshua Reynolds and of the answer which had been returned, which he entirely approved, but it was his royal pleasure that the wish of the executors should be complied with. In his private memorandum of this event, West added that the King's decision, quote, gives us the highest mark of approbation to the merits of our worthy President, as well as his parental attention shown to the arts and to true merit. And here's the King just a few years before the date we're thinking of, in 1792. The King thus resolved the Academy's dilemma as judiciously as possible, granting the wishes of West and the executors, but simultaneously saving face for Chambers, whose technical objections he entirely approved. The body of the deceased president would lie in state in the living model room, which Chambers proposed to hang in black after narrowing it to a 12-foot square. Later in the discussion, it was enlarged to 16 square feet. It was also decided that the order in which the procession is to move was to be devised by the Herald's Office. The authority of the College of Arms, of the Herald's Office, over funerary rites and processions had been eroded by the dramatic growth of the undertaking business throughout the 18th century. But this does not mean that their traditional customs had been abandoned. By the end of the century, as Nigel Llewellyn has argued, the middle classes seem to have adopted modes of mourning previously restricted to the aristocracy itself. By consulting the Herald's Office and procuring the services of the undertaker Adam Wright, Reynolds' executors were clearly taking every available precaution, sensing, no doubt, that the King's decision would stimulate an even larger group of admirers to pay their last respects at Somerset House before joining the grand procession. As it turned out, they were right, and a good deal of time was consequently spent poring over the list of those to be invited, as well as the order of the funeral pageant itself. Many of Reynolds' closest personal friends would travel by coach in the extended procession, but they were carefully and hierarchically entered into the script. The procession was to be headed by 12 peace officers to clear the way, 2 city marshals on horseback, the Lord Mayor's carriage, 2 sheriffs of London, and the undertaker and 10 conductors, also on horseback. They were to be followed by a lid with plumes of feathers, the hearse with 6 horses, and the 10 pallbearers, all of them, as Reynolds' admirers repeatedly pointed out, much to the exasperation of William Blake, peers of the realm. It was worthy of notice, Northcote stated, that in the procession were 3 knights of the Garter, 2 of St. Patrick and 1 of the Thistle, 3 dukes, and 4 noblemen who had held the high office of Viceroy of Ireland. And this is Metcalfe's drawing of the order of the procession, and you can see the coffin at the top. It went through many iterations. At 10:30 on Saturday morning, March 3rd, Reynolds' friends and colleagues met at Somerset House, to which his body had been moved the night before. At 9 o'clock that morning, the officers of the peace had placed themselves at the corner of each street leading to the Strand, Fleet Street or Ludgate Hill, in order to prevent carriages from infringing on the procession. At 10 o'clock, all of the shops between Somerset House and St. Paul's were closed up, as innumerable persons, a phrase used again and again in the early accounts, began to fill both the streets and the windows of the houses along the route of the procession. At 12:15, Reynolds' coffin was placed in the hearse. 15 minutes later, the funeral pageant began its slow progress to the cathedral, taking almost 2 hours to reach St. Paul's. Burke later noted that, quote, "Never was a funeral of ceremony so attended with so much sincere concern of all sorts of people. The day was favorable, the order not broken or interrupted in the smallest degree." After the last carriage had passed through Temple Bar, the gates were shut by order of the Lord Mayor, so that the procession would not be interrupted. When the hearse arrived at the western gate of the cathedral, it was met by the ecclesiastical dignitaries and by the gentlemen of the choir, who chanted the proper psalms, while the procession moved to the entrance of the choir. The full evening choir service was then performed in what was called more than a usually solemn manner. Reynolds' body remained in the center of the choir during the entire ceremony, with the chief mourner and members of the Academy surrounding him. The pallbearers and executors sat on the decanal side, the other noblemen and gentlemen on the cantorial side. After the evening choir service was over, the coffin was conveyed into the crypt below and placed beneath a perforated brass plate under the center of the cathedral's dome. Dr. Jeffreys, the canon residentiary, the other canons, the pallbearers, the academicians, and the entire choir then formed a double circle under the dome. Standing in the middle of this group, the gravedigger dropped a shovel of mold through the aperture of the brass plate onto the coffin below. After the funeral service was chanted, the executors and chief mourner descended into the crypt, while Reynolds' grave was dug beneath the pavement of the cathedral. The mourners then returned in similar order along the same route, arriving at Somerset House at 4:30. The members of the Academy enjoyed a cold collation. They expressed in writing their gratitude to the King and their thanks to the Lord Mayor and sheriffs, and they resolved that they would wear mourning throughout the following month. Thus were deposited, Joseph Farrington wrote in his diary, the venerable relics of Sir Joshua Reynolds, doubly hallowed by a nation's respect and by the tears of private friendship. In spite of the public ceremonial nature of the procession and funeral, the high emotional pitch of the event was clear to virtually everyone who participated in it. We can see this most vividly, of course, in the response of Reynolds' closest friends. Edmund Burke reported that his brother Richard, who attended further back in the procession, quote, was struck almost motionless at his entering at the great west door. The body was just then entering the choir, and the organ began to open, and the long black train before him produced an astonishing effect on his sensibility, on considering how dear to him the object of that melancholy pomp had been. But Burke himself was similarly affected. It was his duty, on behalf of the family and the executors, to thank the assembled academicians at Somerset House late in the afternoon. When he entered the council room, however, his feelings found vent only in tears, for, unable to utter a word, he was obliged to give up the attempt after several fruitless efforts. Edmund Burke was, for once in his life, speechless. But there were similar responses from the nameless, innumerable spectators who lined the streets of the procession. Samuel Felton reported that sighs and tears could be observed in St. Paul's, and that the populace as a whole looked on the pageant with silent and unoffending gaze. Farrington gauged that the decorum of the public on this solemn occasion reflected the state of popular feeling. Well, one of the central paradoxes underlying such ceremonies, as Joseph Roach has eloquently argued, is that, and I quote Joe here, death, the supposed leveler of all distinctions, becomes the very agent of their enunciation. The death ritual in England was in fact carefully predicated on preserving social differentiation. But as Nigel Llewellyn and others have pointed out, the publication of pattern books, the establishment of the undertaking trade, and the availability of the accoutrements of mourning by rental rather than purchase, all brought designer funerals to the masses and threatened the very principle of differentiation. Reynolds's funeral, therefore, enables us to examine the various forces at work in a series of rituals devoted to a commoner, but maintaining rigid hierarchical distinctions. We can see these competing forces at work as the executors consulted with the herald's office and simultaneously hired an undertaker. We can see them at work as we discover Reynolds's early biographers drawing attention to the vast number of Londoners crowding the streets and gazing from the windows, and carefully, one might even say lovingly, describing the rank and honors of the titled pallbearers. If the tenor of Reynolds's funeral was tribute to how personal virtue and professional achievement might raise a modern Englishman, the vehicle was nevertheless order, decorum, and subordination, and no one would have agreed with such conventions more than Reynolds himself. It's important to realize, for example, that Reynolds's procession and funeral were entirely male events. Reynolds's sisters and nieces were not in attendance. The principal mourner was a nephew. The family was represented by Ralph Kirkley and Giuseppe Marchi. Only the male members of the Academy attended. The evening service was chanted by the gentlemen of the choir. Metcalfe noted in his papers that the benches of St. Paul's were to be put into Dr. Jeffrey's ladies' closet, and that the noblemen and gentlemen that attend the funeral to be let into the church at the west doors. Such were the conventions governing the practice of mourning, Llewellyn argues, that those genuinely moved by the loss of a close relative might find themselves completely excluded from any participation in the public funeral. We don't know how Mary Palmer and Offie Gwatkin mourned, nor how they personally memorialized the uncle and benefactor they had lost. And it's therefore not surprising that Sir George Beaumont tactfully asked whether any of Reynolds's friends would be permitted to attend his funeral. Burke, Metcalfe, and Malone realized that they were orchestrating a civic event, carefully prescribing the last rites for a public figure. In doing so, they were surely aware of yet another essential distinction: the difference between the natural body, dead, dissected, waiting to be buried, and the social body, still intact, still closely attached to the larger social and professional bodies Reynolds had once presided over. The rituals associated with death, funerals, and burials had evolved not only to dispose of the natural body in a civilized and emotionally palatable manner, but also to help the larger culture, as Llewellyn has nicely phrased it, take the steps necessary to safeguard the social fabric, thus resisting the challenge that individual deaths made to the well-being of the community or even of the state. The anthropologists of death, Richard Huntington and Peter Metcalfe, have pushed this argument one step further, suggesting that, and I quote them here, the most powerful symbol for the continuity of any community, large or small, simple or complex, is, by a strange and dynamic paradox, to be found in the death of its leader and in the representation of that striking event. This event is discrete, but it is not the work of a moment. The interval between death and burial is viewed by anthropologists as a liminal state, a transitory period set between the polarities of life and death. The length of the interval, over a week in Reynolds's case, allows not just the proper arrangements to be made, those undertakings, but also enables the larger social community to recover from this emotional blow. The importance and the simultaneous fragility of this liminal state help to explain why the machinations of Sir William Chambers pose such a serious threat to the combined wishes of Reynolds' executors, professional colleagues, and family. By working to prevent Reynolds' natural body from lying in state at the Academy, Chambers was denying the significance of Reynolds' social body and of its affinity with the larger institution represented by Somerset House. Instead of promoting social integration and healing, this crucial period threatened to create social discord and disruption. Chambers was not, finally, successful in prohibiting a suitable tribute to Reynolds' social body, but he was successful in intensifying the liminality of this moment, heightening rather than subduing emotion, frustrating and suspending the work of the executors rather than accommodating and facilitating it. Little wonder, then, that the academician's final recourse was to George III himself, still the living paradigm for the doctrine of the king's two bodies. In the end, of course, the social fabric of the Academy was suitably mended, but the death of their longtime president was keenly felt. Succession was an important issue. Here's Northcote. Completely to fill up the vacancy which the loss of such a man produced in society was impossible. Here's Farrington. The mortal remains of Sir Joshua Reynolds having been deposited in their place of rest, the void which his departure suddenly caused in a very large circle of friends and admirers seemed at first to be an irreparable calamity. But it was not irreparable. 3 weeks later, Benjamin West, who had long been a favorite of the king, was elected the Academy's second president. Thomas Lawrence was appointed principal painter in ordinary to the king, and he quickly began work on the royal portraits left in Reynolds' studio. "In you, sir," Reynolds predicted to the young Lawrence, "the world will expect to see accomplished what I have failed to achieve." The painter Henry Singleton captured the entire Academy during a General Assembly in 1795. West is seated in the middle, wearing his hat. He always wore his hat. Lawrence is cross-legged at the left of the canvas. Chambers, holding a plan or scroll, sits at the very center. Dr. Douglas, a bishop of Salisbury, was selected to succeed Reynolds in the club. A year following Reynolds' death, James Barry delivered a complimentary lecture at the Academy, thus healing old wounds and receiving, as a reward, the gift of Reynolds' sitter's chair. Mary Palmer, now a very rich woman, married the Earl of Inchkin, eventually becoming the Marchioness of Thomond. And Reynolds' artistic legacy was now common property, to be adjudicated by the portrait painters as well as by Blake, Constable, and Wordsworth. Well, burying Sir Joshua was not an easy matter. In its propriety, his funeral was consonant with his personal life and professional career. Burying him in a proper manner involved hard work, flexibility, and ingenuity, as well as respect for the customs associated with mortuary ritual. And in each of these respects, it mirrored Reynolds' own traits as an artist and as a social creature. And here he is again, finally, in his Academy robes. Near the conclusion of his 9th discourse on art, by far the shortest of his addresses to the Academy, Reynolds returned to the relationship between individual artists and the larger public sphere to which they should aspire to contribute. In a series of beautifully cadenced phrases, Reynolds speculated on the general and intellectual beauty after which the modern artist must quest. Let me quote him. "It is an idea that subsists only in the mind. The sight never beheld it, nor has the hand expressed it. It is an idea residing in the breast of the artist, which he is always laboring to impart, and which he dies at last without imparting, but which he is yet so far able to communicate as to raise the thoughts and extend the views of the spectator." By what Reynolds calls a succession of art, this elusive and general idea of beauty may extend its effects, quote, "imperceptibly into public benefits, and be among the means of bestowing on whole nations refinement of taste." Reynolds' own career was devoted, in large measure, precisely to this elevation of a national culture through the refinement and elevation of the visual arts. He was the first Englishman, Burke argued, who added the praise of the elegant arts to the other glories of his country. Reynolds' funeral was therefore a tribute to personal as well as collective success, a commemoration through the natural body of the artist, of the larger social body that had been elevated and refined. But it was also a telling reminder of the fault lines that survived within the artistic establishment Reynolds had helped to create, to say nothing of the broader social world in which he had negotiated his way for so long and with such ease. Thank you very much. Well, you certainly have had enough Reynolds, but I'll be happy to take a few questions if any of you have some. Nancy?
I was very puzzled by the reference to the shovelful of mold that was dropped behind the coffin. I was trying to visualize what this mold looked like. And was the mold idea to symbolize decay, or why mold rather than earth?
It meant earth in the 18th century. That's what it meant. But you're getting precisely at its symbolic as well as literal importance. At least a little of the earth is going to be laid on top of him in a symbolic way. Yeah, exactly. I should say, if I can just lapse personal for a moment, that after I had written this chapter, this is 4 years ago, I was in London and I went to St. Paul's, and I was looking at the statue, of course, that was eventually erected there, and I was getting down into the crypt and taking a look at where these exercises, these rites actually took place. And I left. It was a gorgeous day, and without looking behind me, I walked west. If I had looked back at St. Paul's, I would have seen tens of thousands of people walking behind me, because it was September 11th. And I did not realize what was going on. But by the time I got to the West End, I realized. So I had personal associations with kind of following up on that issue of the burial itself. Jim.
In the painting that showed us here, we have is Barry's portrait of the academicians.
Is Singleton, Henry Singleton, yeah.
Would you like to comment on the salience of the Lacan statue background? Possibly an allusion to Reynolds, who was so much admired by Michelangelo, who was influenced by the discovery of that statue?
Yeah, I think the first question to ask is whether, in fact, there was a cast of Laocoon at the Academy, at Somerset House. And because they did have a collection of casts, I think it's entirely possible that that was actually there. But I also sense that this is more like a scene by Zoffany, where you're taking a number of elements and actually putting them together. But I'm not sure I can answer the question about whether there's a specific reason for the Laocoon group itself being there, except that it was and still is probably the most important piece of sculpture from antiquity. Yes, absolutely. Right. And who saw it, and who apparently saw it pulled out of the ground or out of the Tiber when it was discovered during the Renaissance. I think it would be too oblique, actually. I can do a Reynolds and see if I'm a little blinded up here. Any other questions? Well, if not, thank you so much, and I'll see some of you at the signing.